Greetings, everyone. I am Sam Mosim, founder of ConsciousnessandIslam.com. I would like to welcome you to today's presentation titled The 5 Dimensions of Consciousness, an ontological ascent from consciousness of outer self to consciousness of divine nearness. Let's first define the framework of our exploration today. We will build upon the foundation established in our first discussion. We will first summarize our first presentation titled Our Fundamental Reality and the Purpose of Traversing the Material Realm. Because today's presentation is a continuation from our first presentation, which means understanding and insight from the first podcast is a prerequisite to fully grasp this second podcast. B. Examine how consciousness manifests through multiple dimensions of human existence, from the consciousness of outer self associated with the body, to the consciousness of inner dimensions of moral awareness, purification, illumination, and divine nearness. B1. Consciousness of the outer self, or Nafs. B2. Consciousness of the inner self. B3. Consciousness of revelation and divine transmission. B4. Consciousness of pure sanctification and divine illumination. B5. Consciousness of divine nearness. C. Examine the Quranic connection between sleep, death, and consciousness. This will help us understand why the loss of outer awareness does not necessarily mean the annihilation of consciousness itself. D. Finally, we will bring this entire exploration into the practical path of Islam. We will examine how prayer, fasting, charity, and pilgrimage are not empty rituals, but sacred practices designed to create resonance between the consciousness of outer self and the consciousness of inner self. Let's start as per our framework we defined. Before we progress further into our discussion, here is a disclaimer. Throughout this presentation, the terms ruh, spirit, soul, and consciousness will sometimes be used in closely related ways. While each term possesses its own nuances and context-dependent meanings, they often point toward the same underlying reality, viewed from different perspectives. The distinctions between them are generally subtle and depend upon the particular philosophical, theological, or metaphysical framework in which they are being discussed. A. In our first presentation, we explored the following foundational ideas. Number 1. The human being is a complex construct consisting of an outer and an inner dimension. The human being possesses both an outer reality, ad-dhahir, and an inner reality, al-batin. You know me only through my outer dimension, my body, appearance, actions, and words. Yet my inner dimension is what I truly am. At the deepest level, I am an imperceivable, inconceivable, incomprehensible, irreducible, and unclonable, a timeless and spaceless spiritual being having a material essence for a predetermined span of time. Number 2. Consciousness is the fundamental reality. Consciousness is that whose vibration gives rise to everything else. Within consciousness arise all experiences, perceptions, conceptions, comprehensions, meanings, thoughts, emotions, and realities as they are known to us. Rather than consciousness arising from matter, we explored that consciousness itself is primary and fundamental, while matter emerges as an expression within it. Number 3. Consciousness is the field of love. We propose that consciousness is the field of love within which all experiences, forms, and phenomena arise, and through which the underlying unity of existence is reflected. Number 4. Our purpose. The purpose of our existence is the evolution of consciousness through the elevation of love and the reduction of entropy, the degree of disorder within ourselves and within the systems to which we belong. Number 5. The journey of the outer and the inner. In our journey as forms of consciousness, we contemplated an important ontological reality. Our outer dimension, our body, follows the path of dust to dust, or ashes to ashes. However, our inner dimension, our mind, which ultimately finds its locus in consciousness, follows the path of love to love. For while forms appear and disappear, love remains the eternal path, the eternal destination, and the eternal reality from which we came and to which we return. B. In this presentation, we will explore in greater detail how consciousness ontologically manifests itself through several layers of our existence and extends beyond the confines of material life into eternity. In the language of Islamic spirituality, and particularly within the inner philosophical traditions of Islam, for example Sufism, the term ruh or spirit does not merely refer to a biological life force. Rather, it points toward deeper dimensions of foreconsciousness, where perception, conception, comprehension, meaning, experience, illumination, purification, and divine proximity arise. It represents the subtle realities through which the human being journeys from material existence toward divine awareness. From a metaphysical perspective, the human being may be understood as containing multiple dimensions or stations of spirit, multiple layers through which consciousness expresses and experiences. They are symbolic and metaphysical descriptions developed within the spiritual tradition to articulate different functions, states, and stages of consciousness and spiritual realization. In this presentation, we shall examine these dimensions as a structure for understanding the progressive unfolding of consciousness, from ordinary self-awareness to the highest states of spiritual awakening and divine presence. B1. The consciousness of the outer self, Nafs. Qur'an declares in 3-185, every consciousness of the outer self shall taste death. This profound Quranic declaration offers a lens through which we may contemplate one of the fundamental dimensions of human consciousness. The human journey begins with the consciousness of the outer self, traditionally known as the Nafs. Through it, we experience bodily existence, sensory perception, instinct, desire, thought, and interaction with the material world. The verse reminds us that every Nafs, the consciousness associated with our outer self, shall taste death. The journey of the physical form therefore comes to an end, along with its outward modes of perception and experience. The consciousness of the outer self is the subtle life force connected to the body, enabling movement, sensation, breathing, and engagement with the material realm. Spiritually, it represents the most outward dimension of consciousness because it remains closely tied to matter, time, instinct, and sensory experience. Its functions include: number 1, maintaining bodily life; number 2, connecting consciousness to the senses and nervous system; number 3, enabling interaction with the material world; number 4, serving as the interface between soul and body. In Sufi metaphysics, this dimension corresponds to the realm of form, embodiment, appetite, survival, and earthly experience. It is not evil, rather it is necessary for incarnation. Without it, we could neither experience the body nor perceive the world around us. Metaphysically, it may be understood as a localized expression of consciousness within space and time, the soul wearing a biological garment through which it experiences material existence. The Qur'an 32:9 alludes to the formation of the human being before the divine spirit is breathed into Adam. Then he proportioned him and breathed into him from his spirit. This verse indicates that the bodily self, or consciousness of the outer self, serves as the vessel through which higher dimensions of consciousness become manifest during earthly existence. The temporary nature of the consciousness of the outer self is reflected in the phenomena of sleep and death. The Qur'an indicates in 39:42 that ordinary bodily awareness can become veiled, while deeper dimensions of consciousness remain under divine governance. For this reason, Islamic spirituality has often described sleep as a lesser death, suggesting that the outer self is not the entirety of human consciousness. For the purposes of this section, it is sufficient to recognize that the consciousness of the outer self belongs to the realm of time, change, and mortality. It serves as the primary mode through which human experience unfolds, while simultaneously pointing toward deeper dimensions of awareness that transcend ordinary waking consciousness. A detailed examination of sleep, dreams, death, and the continuity of consciousness beyond the outer self is presented in Section C. B2. Consciousness of inner self. The consciousness of the outer self, Nafs, perceives appearances, forms, events, sensations, and personal narratives. The consciousness of the inner self seeks the deeper meaning behind those appearances. Thus, two dimensions of consciousness may encounter the same event, yet interpret it very differently. This dimension represents the awakening of the higher self that begins to govern the lower impulses of the ego. It is the spirit that seeks mastery over inner chaos. Here, consciousness begins moving, from instinct to awareness, from reaction to contemplation, from desire to wisdom. In Sufism, this is the stage where the seeker gains spiritual discipline. The heart awakens, remembrance or dhikr deepens, and the human being begins reclaiming the throne of the inner kingdom. Its functions include spiritual willpower, moral discernment, intuitive perception, governing the lower nafs, alignment with divine ethics. Metaphysically, this dimension symbolizes the emergence of conscious order over psychological entropy. The individual no longer lives merely biologically, but purposefully. This relates to the Quranic concept of the purified soul, as mentioned in 91-9. He has succeeded who purifies it. In many Sufi teachings, the human being is viewed as a microcosmic kingdom. The body is the land. The ego is rebellion. The heart is the throne. And the awakened spirit becomes the rightful sovereign. Let's elaborate the dialogue between the outer and inner self-perception and meaning. The consciousness of the outer self, Nafs, perceives appearances, forms, events, sensations, and personal narratives. The consciousness of the inner self seeks the deeper meaning behind those appearances. Thus, two dimensions of consciousness may encounter the same event, yet interpret it very differently. As this higher dimension awakens, an important realization emerges. Perception and meaning are not necessarily identical. The consciousness of the outer self, Nafs, experiences reality through the senses, emotions, memories, fears, desires, social conditioning, and personal attachments. Because of this, it often interprets events according to appearances alone. The consciousness of the inner self, however, seeks the deeper significance hidden behind appearances. Consequently, the same event can be perceived in two entirely different ways. A loss may appear to the consciousness of outer self as punishment, while the consciousness of inner self may recognize it as purification. A delay may appear to the consciousness of outer self as failure, while the consciousness of inner self may perceive protection. A hardship may appear to the consciousness of outer self as suffering, while the consciousness of inner self may perceive transformation. An insult may wound the consciousness of outer self, while the consciousness of inner self may see an opportunity for humility. In Sufi metaphysics, This distinction is often described as the difference between seeing with the eyes of the ego and seeing with the eyes of the heart. The ego sees fragments. The soul seeks the whole. The ego sees events. The soul seeks meaning. The ego asks, "Why is this happening to me?" The soul asks, "What is this trying to teach me?" And soul illuminates the heart with the same. For this reason, the perception of the outer self may sometimes be an illusion, not necessarily a false sensory experience, but a mistaken interpretation of reality. The event itself may be real, yet the meaning assigned to it may arise from fear, attachment, pride, anger, or ignorance. The Qur'an alludes in 2-216 to this principle when it states, "Perhaps you dislike a thing while it is good for you, and perhaps you love a thing while it is bad for you. Allah knows, and you do not know." From a metaphysical perspective, this verse points toward a limitation of outer consciousness. The consciousness of outer self perceives only a small fragment of the total pattern, while higher consciousness begins to perceive a wider field of meaning. Yet the relationship between these two dimensions is not always one of conflict. As spiritual development progresses, the perception of the outer self can gradually become aligned with the understanding of the inner self. The senses continue to perceive the world, but they are no longer governed by illusion. The mind continues to think, but it becomes illuminated by wisdom. The emotions continue to arise, but they become guided by discernment. In this state, the outer self becomes a faithful servant rather than a rebellious ruler. The human being begins to see reality with increasing clarity because the kingdom within has become ordered. The Sufis often describe this transformation as the polishing of the heart's mirror. When the mirror is clouded by ego, reality appears distorted. When it is purified through remembrance, humility, love, and spiritual discipline, reality is reflected more accurately. Thus, the journey of higher consciousness is not the destruction of the outer self, but its harmonization with the inner self. The goal is not to eliminate perception, but to illuminate it. Not to reject the world, but to see through it. Not to destroy the self, but to allow the lower self to become aligned with the deeper wisdom of the spirit. In this harmony, perception and meaning begin to converge, and the human being gradually becomes what the Sufis call Insan al-Kamil, the integrated human being, whose outer actions reflect inner truth and whose consciousness becomes a clearer mirror of the divine reality. B3. Consciousness of revelation and divine transmission. The consciousness of revelation, kashf, is not something externally imposed upon consciousness. Rather, it emerges ontologically as a natural consequence of the alignment between the consciousness of the outer self and the consciousness of the inner self. In other words, revelation in this sense is not the creation of a new reality, but the unveiling of a reality that was already present, yet concealed by distortion, fragmentation, and egoic interference. It can be integrated as follows. In Arabic, it is termed as Ruh al-Amin. Ruh al-Amin is a Quranic title primarily associated with the angel Gabriel, as declared in Quran 26-193 and 26-194. The trustworthy spirit has brought it down upon your heart. In mystical interpretation, this dimension represents the faculty of receiving divine inspiration, truthful intuition, purified inner perception, and transmission of sacred knowledge. Within the human being, this corresponds to the state where consciousness becomes refined enough to receive higher truths without distortion. This state does not arise abruptly. It emerges through a gradual ontological process of alignment within consciousness itself. In the preceding stage, we observed that the consciousness of the outer self, Nafs, and the consciousness of the inner self, Ruh, can often perceive the same reality differently. The outer self may interpret through desire, fear, attachment, memory, conditioning, and egoic projection, while the inner self perceives deeper meaning, wisdom, and essence. As long as these two dimensions remain fragmented, perception remains divided. Reality is seen through competing interpretations. However, when the consciousness of the outer self becomes sufficiently purified and begins resonating with the consciousness of the inner self, a profound transformation occurs. Perception and meaning begin aligning. Conception and reality begin aligning. Comprehension and wisdom also begin aligning. Experience and realization also begins to align. Appearance and essence begin harmonizing. The apparent Zahir begins reflecting the hidden Batin. At this point, the consciousness of unveiling, the Kashf, naturally emerges. In this framework, revelation is not merely an event, it is an ontological consequence of alignment. From a metaphysical perspective, revelation occurs when consciousness enters into sufficient resonance with truth itself. In this state, inspiration, ilham, spiritual unveiling, kashf, truthful intuition, wisdom, and purified perception naturally emerge. The seeker becomes inwardly trustworthy, for the heart no longer distorts reality through egoic projection. In Sufi understanding, the heart is like a mirror. It does not create the divine light, but reflects it according to its degree of purification. As remembrance and spiritual refinement remove the veils that obscure perception, consciousness becomes increasingly capable of reflecting truths that were always present. Consciousness of pure sanctification and divine illumination. In Arabic, it is termed as Ruh al-Quddus, means the Holy Spirit or Spirit of Holiness. In the Qur'an, this title is also associated with Gabriel, especially in relation to strengthening prophets such as Jesus. But in Sufi metaphysics, it also symbolizes the highest purified state of spirit, the spirit fully illuminated by divine presence. Metaphysically, this dimension represents the return from multiplicity toward unity. The seeker no longer experiences existence merely as fragmented objects, but as signs, ayat, pointing toward the one reality. This state is not isolated from the rest of consciousness, but arises as an integrated ontological unfolding, when the consciousness of the outer self and the consciousness of the inner self enter into resonance. A deeper unveiling occurs in which consciousness of unveiling revelation, consciousness of pure sanctification, and consciousness of divine illumination arise simultaneously as a single coherent event within being itself. This is the dimension of sanctification. Annihilation of ego, fana, divine intimacy, pure consciousness, and spiritual illumination. Its functions include complete purification of the heart, direct experiential awareness of divine reality, transcendence of egoic separation, embodiment of divine attributes such as mercy, wisdom, and love. This is not prophethood, nor equality with prophets. Rather, it refers to spiritual proximity and purification. In Sufi language, this is where the self becomes transparent, the heart becomes luminous, and consciousness becomes absorbed in divine remembrance. Many Sufis describe the culmination of the path as unity, love, annihilation in God, and subsistence through God, Baka. B5. Consciousness of divine nearness, the breath of divine origin. In Arabic term, it is Ruhullah, literally means Spirit of Allah. In Islamic theology, this does not mean a part of God entered the human being. Rather, it signifies honor, divine attribution, sacred origin, and transcendent nearness. The Qur'an repeatedly says that Allah breathed from His Spirit into Adam. This dimension represents the deepest ontological mystery of the human being, that beneath the layers of personality, identity, ego, and conditioning lies a reality connected to divine command, Amr. The Quran says in 17-85, "And they ask you concerning the spirit, our ruh. Say, the spirit is of the affair, command of my Lord, and of knowledge you have been given only a little." Spiritually, Ruhullah is the divine imprint within consciousness, the longing for transcendence, the attraction toward truth, beauty, love, unity, and the infinite. In Sufi metaphysics, this dimension is the mirror through which divine names become reflected in the human being. It is why humans seek eternity, meaning, love, and union. Metaphysically, one may say, the human being feels restless in separation, because the spirit remembers its origin beyond space and time. Just as the consciousness of unveiling and revelation, and the consciousness of pure sanctification and divine illumination emerge as ontological unfoldings, when the consciousness of the outer self and the consciousness of the inner self enter into resonance, so too the consciousness of divine presence and nearness arises simultaneously. These are not separate events occurring one after another, but different dimensions of a single reality disclosing itself through consciousness. When the outer self becomes harmonized with the inner self, the veils that create the illusion of separation gradually dissolve, and consciousness awakens to an immediacy of divine presence that was always there, though previously obscured. Divine nearness is therefore not the movement of God toward the human being, but the unveiling of the reality that was never absent, and that is the infinite.